Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Stick to Wrestling podcast. My name is John McAdam. If you give us 60 minutes, we will give you a wicked good wrestling podcast every week. It's all my fault. Sean Goodwin's not here, and it's all my fault. I have had a ridiculous week. He was ready to record at the regularly scheduled time, and I was not, and thus we had to do all kinds of moving around. Sitting in for Sean in the co-host chair is our good friend David Bixenspan. David, how are you?
I'm good. As we record this on what I guess is going to be the busiest wrestling day of the year, at least as far as current wrestling goes.
Really? What's going on this weekend?
Today we've got the big New Japan show in England, the NXT UK show in Wales, and All Out.
Oh, okay. But
all
by
in
the
one
way,
thing.
this is coming out on a Thursday. We're talking right now. It's August 31st, 2019. But before we get rolling, I want to invite everyone to participate in our Facebook page, just to type in Stick to Wrestling and you will find it. It's a really cool forum where we discuss everything related to the show and things wrestling related that haven't even come up on the show. So give it a shot if you have not already. Let's get rolling. We are going into the final leg of our summer series, and we're going to talk about the summer of 1984. We are actually going to try not to talk about the wrestling war. I mean, it's impossible not to, but we're going to not make that the focus because, I mean, the wrestling war has been autopsied to death, yes, even on this show. Let's talk about the WWF to start with. They were in the midst of going national, and WWF All-Star Wrestling and Championship Wrestling and their cable program, everything, early summer 1984 was an infomercial for the Brawl to end it all, with the Wendi Richter match going against Fabulous Moolah. Moolah had held the WWF women's title forever. I don't even know who the champion was before her. And in the middle of all this was a pop star named Cyndi Lauper. It's hard. I can't think of a 2019 comparison to Cyndi. She was a huge star. She was a new star, but she was a huge star. You couldn't watch MTV for 90 minutes without seeing one of her videos. Bix, what are your thoughts on the Brawl to end it all from 1984?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that I've never seen the actual MTV broadcast because
I know that
for some reason. Yeah, we talked about this on, I think, the Facebook group or one of the Facebook groups recently. For whatever reason, other than one person whose copy broke before they got a DVD recorder, I've never seen a tape of that in the wild. And I have no idea why. Just the MSG Network broadcast of the whole show. So I've never, I've seen War to Settle the Score, plenty, but I have never seen Brawl to End at all. So I don't.
Crazy.
Go ahead.
No, I was just interjecting. That's crazy because back in the tape trading days, it was considered common. Yet I don't have it, and yet it's not on YouTube.
And I can't even think of where it would be. I mean, I can think of one or two people that might have it, and it just got overlooked. As far as people that still have their VHS and stuff, but. Yeah, so I don't even know, what do you remember about the actual broadcast? Was it similar to how they handled War to Settle the Score?
Yeah, it was very similar. It was an hour special, all kinds of interviews with celebrities and, B-list and C-list celebrities like Billy Squier and whoever. They made it into a big event. I mean, I remember I had probably 10 people over my house watching it, and most of them, a lot of them didn't want to watch it, but that's what everyone else was doing. But I think what Vince tried to do with Wendi Richter was really, really smart. He tried to get women's wrestling into it. That way, he's not just appealing to the little boys and teenage boys and adolescent boys. They're going after the girls, too.
I agree, but it had a lot of the same problems the WWE women's booking would. I mean, there are even still elements of it now. Obviously, that's been reduced, but I don't think it ever could have worked based on the way he's doing it, where it was, for the most part, the same champion and their one opponent booking. And that just kept going and going forever. And that would never have worked, ever.
The way they did it, and that's what I was going to say. I agree with you because once Richter versus Schmoolah had dissolved, once Cyndi Lauper kind of cooled off a little bit, it was just the Wendi Richter show, and she didn't have any real opponents. I mean, they burned the angle at WrestleMania where she lost to Leilani Kai right before WrestleMania, and it had to be the most obvious thing in the world if you were a wrestling fan that okay, Wendi lost the title so that she could win it back, and that was the thing. Like once they established Wendi, it was like, where do you go from here? And the answer the WWF had was, I don't know.
Right, and I don't know if Wendi was even the best choice of the Moolah camp, because I've seen the argument she's the people saying she was maybe the most conventionally attractive of the troupe and that's why they went with her. But even if the WWF in that era was not necessarily one for good wrestling in the traditional sense, or at least that wasn't necessarily what they were trying to sell, I don't know if Richter's really the best choice. Like, I feel like they could have maybe done more with someone who could, just because, there's not really any substance once the bell rings, even in terms of her physical charisma or whatever, compared to someone who was maybe a better worker, like Velvet McIntyre or Princess Victoria or someone. So I don't know. Plus, and her promos were not good anyway. So I don't know if they had anyone who was a polished promo, but I don't think the Richter experiment ever really could have worked the way they wanted regardless. And, as I'm sure we'll talk about too, it didn't really draw. And the MSG show, even once they added the Battle Royal and the Hogan title defense, did not do especially well.
Yeah, I can't say how well Wendi did as a draw. I've always maintained that the WWF product was the draw, unless it was a smaller town and you were bringing in someone like Andre the Giant. I can say this. I was at the Boston Garden in 1984 when Wendi was introduced, and she did get a huge pop. Now, there's a difference between getting a pop and selling tickets, but she was over. I can tell you that firsthand.
Yeah, over with the actual ticket buying public that was there.
Yeah, and that counts for something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I always thought that Wendi was the best choice, just because I couldn't think of a better choice for the reasons that you listed. That she was traditionally attractive, that she seemed athletic. I didn't mind her interviews; they came across as very. What's the word I'm looking for? Sincere. She seemed kind of down home and, happy to be there sort of thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I get that. Although, one thing that doesn't get talked about much, like as far as the way they tried to do it, they probably did also go too far in the direction of like the whole weird thing, and it didn't last long, where they kind of tried to imply that her and Hogan were a couple. Which didn't really click.
It wasn't even implied. It was like barely hinted at that something, may have been going on between the two of them. They definitely didn't push the idea. And I think, frankly, that would have hurt Hulk Hogan. But all right, what else is going on in the WWF? The Hulk Hogan clearly is the king of this promotion. Whoever the number 2 babyface is, whether it be Snuka, Slaughter, whoever, there's a big gap between Hogan and that person. And Hogan doesn't really have a program. He doesn't have a feud. He's wrestling Paul Orndorff and Greg Valentine on a regular basis. And here's the thing, and tell me if you agree with this. I don't think a single person going to that arena thinks Paul Orndorff or Greg Valentine or Dr. D. David Schultz, whoever, has any chance of taking that title from Hulk Hogan, yet the arenas are filling up anyway.
Yeah, and from the perspective of the story, I think part of it just is because it's cold. That he's not really working any programs, that no one's conditioned in any way that they would be to see a title change. So it is extra impressive that Hogan's drawing without any issues, even in the places where he maybe was doing, well, no, he wasn't even doing like one and market house show programs yet. That doesn't really come till early 85 like with Morocco, with places like MSG. Like, does he have a multiple match series in any major arena, even without a TV angle in '84?
Big John Studd, which was an accident, but that was the only one I can think of in Madison Square Garden from '84. I think he fought Piper December '84 and January '85 in Boston. I could be off, consecutive cards. I could be off by a couple of months on that. But yeah, for the most part, every night, every arena, it's one and done.
And I think people who haven't watched that much of Hogan specifically in '84 don't get how much of a compelling personality he was, because when it comes to just what's visible from home videos and all sorts of other stuff, it's more 85, 86 on. And once you get into 86, the Hogan character becomes so much more obnoxious.
Yeah.
Which, probably not coincidentally, is when he started to get more booking power, too.
True.
And go ahead.
No, please finish what you were going to say, man.
So you watch Hogan '84 promos, especially if you're used to later Hogan stuff, and it's like, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. He's so much more charming and interesting and entertaining. It's just like night and day.
That's an excellent point. I mean, Hogan, like you said, 85, 86 came across on TV as a guy who might have been a little bit full of himself, whereas in 84, he was doing great things in the AWA for the 2 or 3 years prior, but now he's doing something not only in the Northeast, he's doing it nationally, and that's a big deal. But I mean, I've told this story before. I remember it was either January or February '84. Hogan was making his debut at the Boston Garden as a good guy. So he's like the hot new thing. And we get there, and the first thing we see is a sign, the ticket gate was closed. And there's a sign saying, completely sold out. And then there were people like begging to buy your tickets, hundreds of people that wanted to go to the show that were, please sell me your tickets. And I was like, no way, I want to see this. So great memories there. Okay, another thing highlighting summer of '84 in the WWF, the big Roddy Piper versus Jimmy Snuka feud, which started with the infamous Piper's Pit, where Piper just did everything humanly possible to humiliate Jimmy Snuka. And to this day, I really feel like they overdid it. They made Snuka look stupid. Bix, what are your thoughts on the whole thing?
I get your point of view on that, but as far as him just standing there and taking it, how much different was it from a regular Piper's Pit? I mean, it's different because it's his character not to talk that much, or his gimmick, I should say. But other than that, is it really that different from another Piper's Pit until Piper attacks him?
Yeah, Piper threw a banana in his face, and I think the average viewer wants Jimmy Snuka. Oh, you want to throw a banana in my face and knock the guy out?
That's fair. That should be the cue for him to pop off.
Yeah. And I just think they took way too much off Snuka, and maybe Snuka was due to cool off anyway after being red hot late '82 into 1983. Maybe that just wasn't going to last forever, but I think that Piper's Pit really hurt Snuka long term.
Granted, he probably would have lost the momentum anyway when he had to go to rehab.
True. And that's another thing that sidetracked him, where, every WWF TV program shows the clip of Piper injuring Snuka, so that Snuka could be off TV for a few months. And I think that hurt him too.
Yes. Now, by the way, do you have any idea why there was such a big gap between the angle being taped and airing in syndication?
That's a good point, and I have no idea. I think my best guess is they wanted to finish the Roddy Piper versus Rocky Johnson series before they went into it, but then why would they tape it in the first place? So that's a good question. I really don't know.
Because it was only 2 months?
It was like 7 or 8 weeks, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, and they did go right into it in St. Louis, though. It aired pretty quickly in St. Louis for whatever reason, and then they just sat on it. But the TV during that period is a little weird too, because isn't it kind of slapped together, and they'll show stuff from multiple tapings and multiple locations, like during the late spring, early summer that year?
Oh, totally. You know, people today act like Vince McMahon had this well planned out, well thought out machine. And no, the WWF like threw a lot of stuff against the wall and just saw what stuck.
I think part of it too was, I think around that time might have been when they were switching the TV production from St. Louis to Baltimore too, as far as from a KPLR to Video One. So I think that could be why things were a little haphazard with the TV, at least during that time.
That's an excellent theory, because that would at least explain some of what was going on. But yeah, I mean, from every aspect, whether it to be, like we're pointing out, booking or just bringing guys in and, okay, what are we going to do with this guy? I mean, there were times where they were really disorganized. Then again, there were times where they had everything completely rolling the way it should have. I don't want to make it sound like, Vince didn't know what he was doing, because he certainly did. Summer of 1984. I don't have the date in front of me. I believe it was August. It was in the Philadelphia Spectrum. Bob Backlund wrestles his last match in the WWF until like 1992 or 1993. Bix, your thoughts on Backlund after Hulk Hogan came in?
Almost startlingly de-emphasized. And I guess it's not surprised with hindsight, because I think I'm like a lot of people my age, where until I started to trade tapes and stuff, I thought Backlund was gone almost right after Hogan won the title. And then he's around for like 6 months in the mid-card. And it's really striking, though. Like, he's basically demoted to like, Twilight Tony Gurria tag team partner level.
Yeah. I mean, he had a couple of breaks. He wrestled a main event in Boston against Paul Orndorff, which was one of the worst matches I've ever seen. He wrestled a main event against Bob Backlund in Madison Square Garden, where it seemed like he got a really good reaction, and it was a good match. Like, I don't know where that came from, but in Boston, he was getting booed. When the match started against Orndorff, he was getting heavily booed. And then after they have this absolutely awful 30-minute Broadway, Backlund was getting booed like a heel. It was, just unbelievable. The story was that Vince McMahon told Bob, look, you have to dye your hair green and turn heel, or you're going to quit. And Bob quit. And I always thought that was Vince's way of firing Bob without actually firing him. What do you think, Bix?
Wasn't dye your hair green like the Backlund exaggerated version of it to kind of make a point? I always thought it was dye his hair blonde, and then Bob's thing was just to say, "Oh, I didn't want to dye my hair green," kind of as a way of saying, "Oh, they're becoming a cartoon."
Okay,
but still basically the same thing. I kind of agree with that, but because at that point, it's not like Vince Jr. was really doing anything like that yet, anyway.
Yeah.
Any kind of like extreme re-gimmicking of anyone. So I do buy that it was a way to get rid of him, because granted, it's not, with how much he had devalued him by that point, by that summer, there really was nothing else you could do with him other than kind of try to turn him heel and get something out of that. Yeah, so I can see it being. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say Vince knew there was no way in 1984 Bob Backlund would turn heel.
No, but I could also see it being well, maybe if the 1% does happen, that he could see it through, but no, it's not something he would actually do. And then Bob he wrestles for basically the next year, and then he vanishes.
Yeah. And I've always wondered, did Vince book Bob Backlund the way he did towards the end Did he purposely devalue Backlund so that he wouldn't have value to an NWA territory or the AWA? Because by 19, there was a big wrestling war going on, and you would think that Crockett, or Watts or the AWA or someone would be really interested in having the former WWF champion on board. Yet there was no real attempt to make that happen, nor I don't think Bob would have fit in. I don't think he would have gotten over anywhere.
Well, he is a regular on the Pro Wrestling USA shows, but it didn't. It's weird, even though you would think he'd be something of a better fit in that environment, especially among the AWA guys, it doesn't ever really click. Like, no. It's a fun curiosity to see stuff like, here he is teaming with Jerry Lawler at what's mostly a Crockett taping. But other than that, there's just nothing there.
No, and you're right. Pro Wrestling USA put a lot into Bob Backlund, and as soon as I saw it, I just had the feeling that it was not going to work, that the demand for Backlund just wasn't there, and it turned out it just really wasn't. Bob didn't help things anyway. I forget exactly what he was asking for per appearance. I think it was like $5,000 guaranteed, and he just wasn't going to get that.
Did he get a day job pretty quickly, or like was he teaching or coaching or anything like right off of leaving WWF, or was he just living off his savings when he wasn't wrestling, or what?
I am pretty sure Bob had the option to live off of his savings because he did not spend money. He was well known for being good on the road and saving money, et cetera. So I think he just worked and coached when it was on his terms. And hey, good for him. The guy was on the road for 6 years, breaking his back, and he did what he was supposed to do, and now he can do whatever he wants.
Yeah, I mean, more power to him. And he was getting involved in promoting some, because I always forget, what was the name of his promotion that like partnered in some of the Crockett and Pro Wrestling USA shows? Was it Northeast Wrestling, or was it something else?
I think it was Northeast Wrestling.
Yeah, and some of those did draw, so I don't know if he was making decent money on that or what, too, but that was there.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah, and like I said, he's just doing what, that's retirement. You get to work doing whatever you want to do, so hey, good for him. Another thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of more wrestling war oriented. One of the fun things about being a fan in 1984 is turning on a WWF program, whether it be TNT or Championship Wrestling, and just seeing who the next guy the WWF brought in. And I'm not exaggerating when I say I think it averaged about one new guy per week. And I mean, Bix, did you feel like the roster was oversaturated at all? Because I kind of did at the time.
Of course it was. Les Thornton comes in, and then does he even debut, or does he just disappear and then finally show up as champion after like 2 months after Black Saturday?
I think your that version sounds about correct. I mean, and some of the guys they brought in, I mean, Mr. Wrestling 2, Mad Dog Vachon, that they have the spoiler guys they have absolutely no role for. And I would think that if you're leaving a promotion where you're getting a push and going to the WWF, yeah, there's an upside, there's a big upside, but there's also a huge downside.
Yeah, and a lot of those guys who they didn't know what to do with would just disappear from TV for months and be used on the Middle Eastern tours.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, or they would disappear to C shows. Like you'd have Mr. Wrestling 2, out in Iowa or Indiana or something where no one knows who he is unless you're a magazine person. And I don't know if he gave up a push in Mid-South to do this, but he was getting a big push in Mid-South when he left.
Yeah, and people think of him as being a guy who came along with the Georgia purchase, but he wasn't.
No.
I mean, the only guys who came along with the Georgia purchase, if I remember right, were Nikolai Volkov, Spoiler, Les Thornton, and Freddie Miller as an announcer. I think that's it, right?
I think that's it. And Volkov, he landed in the perfect spot because the Iron Sheik versus Sergeant Slaughter feud was getting old. And hey, we've got a new foreign menace for Sergeant Slaughter to fight against. And obviously they put together the tag team with the Iron Sheik. So he got a lucky break, but he was the only one.
Yep. And I can see why Spoiler went along with it, because he was getting older. He really hadn't been doing that much until the Georgia run. So even though he was one of those guys who wasn't exactly getting used well, I can see why he stuck with it for a while. Les Thornton to me is weird because once they bring him in for a brief period, you have two different WWF junior heavyweight champions.
Yes. No, and you're right. The Spoiler, since about 1980, had been in and out of the business. I think I think he'd been retired for about a year when he came back to Georgia. So I can see him just going along with whatever. But anyway, moving on to the summer of 1984 in the Mid-Atlantic territory. I mean, I didn't know it when it was happening, that Dusty Rhodes had come in. He was the new booker, and he was starting from scratch, and he completely changed that territory. Any thoughts on early Dusty in Mid-Atlantic?
It's weird because it doesn't really feel like Crockett as we know it, either from pre-Dusty or once Dusty really settles in. He's very much adjusting, and it also showed at the box office because that territory was not doing well for quite a while that year.
No, it was not. Post Starrcade 1983, that promotion went into a funk.
Pun intended or pun not intended?
Pun totally not intended. You got me.
And it's really striking, too, because that's not a territory that really happened in. Like, they did not have that many business ebbs and flows up until that point, as far as I know. They were a very consistent territory, both, for the decades where they were kind of a smaller, tag team territory. And then, for the previous, I guess, 7-8 years as the big NWA territory. So, when things in that territory, which is, the biggest money territory of the NWA promotions, gets to the point that Barry Windham quits because he's getting shorted on payoffs, that things are not going well.
I've always wondered about Barry Windham's story as far as, Dusty bringing him and Mike Rotundo in from Florida, and Barry was saying I was making $125 a week, which is specifically what he said on his shoot interview. And I don't want to sit here and call Barry Windham a liar, but I mean, if they brought him in right away and they put him on the road right away, I mean, that just doesn't sound right for 1984 figures.
That figure doesn't sound right, but do I totally buy that he was making absolutely terrible money by the usual standards of Crockett Promotions for that era? Sure.
Okay, I can see that.
Granted, I mean, do we know if Dusty was doing the payoffs or someone else? I don't know, but since we're talking about Dusty, that reminds me of something I wanted to talk about that you had mentioned the message you sent with some of the notes for this show. Yeah, so Dusty comes in from Florida, takes a large amount of the crew with him, especially for that era of a booker changing territories.
Mm-hmm.
And it got me thinking about how it seems like Dusty, for whatever reason, also was given an unusual amount of autonomy by the promoters he booked for in terms of both Crockett and Eddie Graham. Like, all the stories of Eddie Graham having to send Dusty out of Florida. So because Dusty was getting overexposed, but also because Dusty as booker had no real restraint when it came to expenses on major shows. And I wanted to ask you, I feel like you'd have a better idea than me about this. How common was it for a booker to be given that much free reign to where they were given leeway in terms of booking buildings and stuff like that.
I that's a good point, and I cannot think of one. And like you said, both in Florida and in the Carolinas, Dusty seemed to have just, as the word you used, a lot of autonomy as far as not only booking angles, but booking buildings, booking major shows, etc. I have heard over the years that was part of the deal with Crockett, that Dusty was going to get to do what he wanted to do without any interference, and that he would, he made it clear he was going to make himself the top star, which in 1984 made sense.
Yeah, I mean, well, Dusty really doesn't lose any steam, I think, till 86.
I still think things were going well in 86. I see 87 as kind of the turning point.
Well, I mean, the thing with 86 is that's when he really starts to get out of shape.
Yeah,
I would say is 86, and then 87 is when crowds start to turn on him.
Yeah, I mean 85. I think the crowd started turning on him to the point where he couldn't do studio interviews in Atlanta. He had to send them in. I always thought that was more of a Ric Flair is so over that his opponent is going to get a lot of heat. Plus, I think, some fans just didn't like Dusty. But overall, I mean, whenever I went to an NWA show in like 86, I went to a couple in 86 and Dusty was over like crazy. And he seemed to lose something along the line in 87. But you're right. I remember seeing him with the NWA title around his waist in 86 and me going, oh my God, he is huge.
And I think it affected his image, at least in part because I think a maybe underrated part of his appeal was that people don't talk about it that much, but Dusty was an excellent athlete.
Yes.
Like, really especially through the early 80s, and he still had some of it through like 85. Like, he could move. He could really move when he wanted to. And especially if you watch the younger stuff like that, the match from Detroit with him and Murdoch against Ben Justin Stomper which I think is the earliest Dusty match. Like, he moves as well as Murdoch does. Or you watch like some of those angles, like, I forget the one from Florida where he pounces over the desk at one of the heels. Like,
LeDuc, yeah.
Yeah, he could move. Like, eventually it wasn't necessarily his style to do so, but he was like a Buddy Rose or an Adrian Adonis in that he really was a tremendous athlete in that body. It just didn't necessarily look like it cosmetically. And I gotta think that not having that, all of a sudden he's not necessarily, dynamite in that package anymore. And as he has the ego more on promos, it's not the same Dusty anymore.
No, you're right. And you're right. Early in his career, he could move. Dusty was an excellent athlete. Dusty was the starting shortstop on his high school team. I was not the starting shortstop on my high school team. You want to know why? I wasn't good enough. But anyway, I had to play somewhere else. Tully Blanchard comes in and gets a mega push. Now, before this actually happened, I saw Tully on Southwest Championship Wrestling. I thought he was really good. But I also thought that if he ever came like to the WWF in the Backlund era, he would not have main evented Madison Square Garden against Bob Backlund. I always thought he was good enough to be a big fish in a small pond, which he was in Southwest, or a small fish in a big pond, like he would have gotten an Iron Mike Sharp type push in the WWF. But no, Dusty sees something that I do not see, and Tully gets over like crazy in 1984, basically until he gets stale around 87-ish. I mean, any thoughts on Tully in the NWA?
I think the best way to put about what you were saying, because, I mean, I've always liked the earlier Tully stuff I've seen, but he really was not clicking that much as a singles, even in his home promotion. Like, when they're trying to put, early Burt Prentice with you as a heater.
That was insane. That was so bad.
So I agree that it's not something I don't think anyone would have expected. Maybe bring him in as part of a tag team, but not bring him in as your top heel. And Yeah, I mean, that's a huge credit to Dusty, I think, that he saw that and knew what he could get out of him. And then credit to Tully, too, is that he pretty quickly grows with the role.
That's a good way of putting it. He grew with the role. I mean, getting off of 84, but when he won the United States title from Magnum TA summer of 85, I could not believe it. I could not believe Tully Blanchard was the United States champion, holding the same title that guys like Roddy Piper and Greg Valentine, Wahoo, Magnum TA, etc. held. And like you said, he grew into the role. Good for him.
And I think some of that was also just tweaking how he was presented too, because at least early on, he feels kind of like almost like an unintentional Buddy Landel in terms of being, I don't know if discount Flair is the right way to put it, but he had the goofy suits. He wasn't as polished up looking. So he seemed like more of a gimmick. And then things kind of grow into him being more of a actually suave type and wearing the nice suits and being differentiated enough from a Flair type that he's able to stand out on his own.
That's a really good analogy that you made about, him being kind of the Buddy Landel type, the guy who's trying to be something he's not. And by the way, everyone, in 1984, when you saw Tully come on TV with one of those suits, you were just like, oh my God, that is horrific. What is wrong with this guy? 1978 is over, pal. But that's what he was trying to do. So anyway, continuing, I've made my thoughts known on the Wahoo McDaniel turn. There are some guys you just don't turn. You can't. He's too much of a legend. You can't let all of his fans down. At the same time, it was a very logical and effective turn. This being Wahoo turning into a bad guy in 1984, turning on Ricky Steamboat and teaming with Tully Blanchard. Bix, your thoughts on that?
I think the idea of him being Tully's protector is what makes it work. I think if he does just any kind of solo turn, by that point, I don't know if it's necessarily like a turning Mario Milano in Australia type thing, but I don't think it would have worked nearly as well as just as him with him as just a heel on his own. But that he's turning heel specifically to protect this asshole, you're given a very specific reason to resent him.
Yeah. I mean, I remember too, when he turned in Georgia, he came out and to protect Ronnie Garvin, who was a babyface, and then he turns around and does an interview, and Garvin goes to talk, and Wahoo's like, no, wait a minute, I got something to say. Because there's a lot of, what did he say? There's a lot of things you'd be surprised at some of the things I would do for money. And he just lays a chop into Ronnie Garvin. And the next thing you know, he's out there with Jimmy Hart. And I had known from the magazines that Wahoo had turned. And even then I was surprised by it. But anyway, we talked about Dusty being brilliant in 1984. And he definitely was. One of the best things he did. And again, I can't emphasize enough how brilliant this was. He comes up with an idea to create a character, Ivan Koloff's nephew, a new Ivan Koloff, a new and improved Ivan Koloff. And he takes this bodybuilder from Minnesota who is still in wrestling school. And this guy is huge, and he shaves his head. He shows up, and he's Nikita Koloff, instant superstar. And that Dusty had created on his own. Fix your thoughts on early Nikita Koloff.
I think the way I've heard the story, I think this is from Ivan's book, is that Nikita pretty much hadn't barely even started training with Eddie Sharkey, or maybe even hadn't started training yet. And I think just Animal knew him from being a bouncer with him. I'm not sure he even trained yet, because Ivan was training him before every show. If I remember, I think the story was something like I forget if it's Ivan or Crockett who brings it up, and then Animal says, "I know the perfect guy," and they bring in Scott Simpson, and he immediately commits to the gimmick by changing his real name and ordering Russian language magazines to his apartment so the mailman would see them and stuff like that. And he was awfully green, and he was awfully green for a couple of years. But thankfully for him, Ivan Koloff was a very good teacher, and he was able to be brought along in just the right way. And, within about a year, he's able to be, at least for a little while, the top heel in the territory.
Yeah, a year later, this guy who didn't exist in early 1984 was headlining baseball stadiums against Ric Flair in summer of 1985. And yeah, as far as Koloff being trained, I know Koloff himself mentioned that he would travel with Ivan Koloff and Don Kernodle, and they would try to teach him everything they could on car rides. So you're right, maybe he hadn't been trained at all. And if that's the case, man, that's pretty scary. But anyway, moving on to World Class, summer of 1984. They have the Texas Stadium show in May, where Kerry wins the NWA title from Ric Flair, but they also tell us, basically give us a big hint where this promotion's going, where Gino Hernandez, who had not been seen anywhere for over a year after disappearing from Southwest Championship Wrestling, shows up at the stadium show and announces that he wants to challenge the winner of the Chris Adams-Jimmy Garvin match to a match for the American title. And the next thing we know, a few weeks later, he's on TV with both the American and Texas title belts over his shoulders. He is getting the mega push, and he was going to be the lead heel for about the next year and a half. Bix, your thoughts? Gino Hernandez returns and gets the rocket push.
It was great because I think at this point we've all seen enough more variety of Gino with the Houston footage coming out that I think we have a better picture of him. And I think he's not underrated anymore necessarily the way he used to be, at least to the degree I think he used to be. But I love that run in Dallas, especially once he hooks up with Adams and Jake Roberts. There's something about as good as the team with Adams was, there's something about what Jake added, and then Nicola Roberts coming in and being simultaneously Gino's bodyguard and Jake's girlfriend.
Yep.
And I think they're historically maybe one of the most underrated heel groups of that era. They work tremendous together. And I don't think it works without Gino, but I wanted to mention that first off, just because I don't think they get nearly enough credit for how well all those four played off of each other.
That's an excellent point. That was a really good faction. And I think Jake finished up in World Class. I think he started summer of 84. And I think they finished him up Christmas night when he did a clean job for Mike Von Erich, and Mike used the claw for the first time. I'm not sure why his run there was so short, if he just got, a really good offer from Bill Watts and figured he'd make more money over there. But yeah, Jake was very underrated in World Class. And I agree, that faction was a really good one. And Gino Hernandez and Chris Adams against Kerry and Kevin Von Erich, I thought was an outstanding feud. And I thought it was, and this is summer of 84 is what built up to all of that. And it was really organic. I mean, Chris turns on his good friend Kevin Von Erich. They used to be pen pals. Gino is a natural bad guy. I thought it all made sense. Bix, what are your thoughts?
I thought it absolutely made sense. And I don't know what it is about that feud too, that as good as the Freebird series is, I think in terms of in-ring, more like chemistry, I think Kevin worked the best with Adams as far as a singles and as far as tag team matches with Dynamic Duo. I don't know what it is. There's something it doesn't feel in those matches. I mean, maybe for Adams and Gino it did to a degree, but at least watching them, and I don't even mean that. I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this so it doesn't sound like an insult, because I'm trying to figure out the right way to word it. It feels more cooperative in the sense it feels more like a really good wrestling match than the Freebirds matches where it does look like he's just hauling off and legit stiffing people. Yeah. If that makes any sense. Like it feels more like he is trying to go out there and have a great match.
I agree. As a matter of fact, it was Labor Day 1985 where I think both Kevin Von Erich and Chris Adams each of them had the best match of their career that night. It was a match where they had Gino locked in a cage outside the ring. It was in Fort Worth. David Manning got his head caught in the ropes, and everyone was afraid he was going to die. That was like a 4.5-star match, and easily the best I've ever seen from either guy.
I'm trying to remember if I've seen that one. I mean, the hairs versus hairs match from '85 is tremendous too.
It was. I mean, think about that match drawing like over 20,000. But please go ahead.
Right. One thing I want to ask you about though with Gino, do you think he, as a worker, as opposed to just a promo and a personality, he's underrated? And how much do you think it has to do with that he was kind of, I don't know if awkward is the right word, but kind of like similar to Piper or Michael Hayes in that he didn't move quite as smoothly as everyone else in the ring?
We're talking about Gino?
Yeah.
Oh, Gino, there were so many awkward moments with him as a worker. I mean, he tried to do that elbow smash off the top rope or the middle rope, and it never looked good. It always looked really clumsy. Gino's one of those guys. He was a middle of the road worker who, if he had a really good opponent, you'd have a really good match. If he didn't have a good opponent, you would have some very awkward moments in that ring.
I think maybe part of it is that he was probably better suited for his role in Houston, where he was able to have more kind of like straight up brawls.
Yeah.
Relative to World Class, where at least after a while, he's kind of expected to be more of like a smooth tag team wrestler.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I mean, and here's the thing too. I want to point this out. I mean, we're in the middle of a wrestling war. It's hard. It would be hard, you would think, for World Class to finally find a replacement for the Freebirds. And instead of like looking around at the different territories, maybe we can get this guy from Florida, maybe we can get this guy from Georgia. They picked a guy who'd been out of the business for a year, and it worked out extremely well. Now, we talked about Chris Adams. After the Texas Stadium show, Chris Adams is now being managed by the babyface Gary Hart, who had been in a little bit of a brief feud with Skandor Akbar. And he comes out, and it's a babyface wrestler, the babyface manager, and Gary Hart calmly explains that he is going to lead Chris Adams to the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship. Now, I feel very dense saying this. It did not strike me immediately as being obvious that, Chris Adams is turning heel soon, yet it should have. I mean, Bix, your thoughts on Gary Hart managing Chris Adams?
Well, I don't know if I'd say that Gary Hart was a babyface manager at first, as much as he was not explicitly a heel.
Good way to put it.
Chris Adams brings him back into the territory, and Chris Adams is saying, basically, I'm still a babyface, and yeah, this guy has had some issues in the past, but look at his track record of success. I would be stupid if he's willing to manage me not to let him do it. And then slowly but surely, he becomes a little bit more of an asshole, little bit by little, and finally turns on Kevin Von Erich. And I don't think I've ever seen a more heated stadium angle than that.
Oh, no.
Than turn at the Cotton Bowl.
That was one of my favorite wrestling moments of all time, because it shows how invested the fans were in it. What I'm talking about is they did an angle at the Texas Stadium show where Adams was kind of towards the end of a heel turn, but he wasn't a full-fledged heel yet. He grabs the mic and he dares Kevin Von Erich to wrestle him, not brawl, to wrestle. Kevin wins fair and square, and he takes the mic and he tells a rather I don't know. Chris looked like he couldn't believe he lost. And Kevin says, I don't believe I'm going to do this, but if you're willing to get rid of Gary Hart right now, I'll shake hands. We'll put all this behind us. Put all this behind us. And Chris grabbed a chair and he hit Kevin from behind. And someone grabs the mic and says, we need an ambulance down here right now. And you hear these girls, screaming and crying in the background. And then they show them on camera. And you're like, oh my God, this girl thinks Kevin Von Erich legitimately is going to die. And I don't know. I kind of miss those days where people, everyone wasn't in on the fact that it was a work. What do you think, Bix?
I agree. But I mean, as you've talked about a bit before, on this and other podcasts, more people than get credit for in that era knew something was up, as much as they didn't necessarily know how or why or when or etc. But it was still just enough that you have just enough suspension of disbelief that if you have an ambulance coming and Mark Lawrence frantically screaming over the house mic, then it feels real.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. One other thing from World Class, Mike Von Erich, who had made his debut, I believe that either the Christmas or the Thanksgiving before 1983, wins the American title. And I thought he won it from Gino Hernandez sometime in the summer. I thought it looked so bad. At least Kevin was a legit football player. David played basketball. Kerry was a legit track athlete. I don't think Mike did anything. He did not have anything resembling a pro wrestler's body. I mean, Greg Gagne had a better wrestling body than Mike Von Erich in '84. And it was, to me, it was just so obvious that, okay, it's the promoter's son, and they're using this to try to get him on the same par as Kevin and Kerry. And I thought it was, to this day, I thought it was just so awful. What I think they should have done with Mike is made him like an underdog type. Like, okay, he's not Kerry. Well, Kerry's one of the world's best, and he's not Kerry, at least not yet. Kevin, one of the world's best, he's not Kevin yet. I think it would have been more effective to push Mike that way than immediately try to jam him down everyone's throat as a superstar. Bix, what are your thoughts on the matter?
To me, the thing that always kind of summed it up was when Fritz is talking about Mike on the David tribute episode of the TV, where I don't know the last time you've seen this, but it's burned into my brain.
Okay.
Where Fritz is talking about, like, we have Mike. He looks just like David. And he goes so hard on, granted, Mike had already debuted. He'd been in for, a little less than 6 months, something like that by that point. But still, he is framed by that so hard as a replacement for David by his dad.
Yes.
And that would be creepy in and of itself. But the fact is, Mike was never going to be David. In the ring, as a promo, anything. And, we hear now that Mike did legit want to be in the wrestler. That there had been stories over the years that he didn't. And, I mean, he definitely looked like he wanted it less than Chris did. But, if they're saying that he was into it, I'll believe it. But he never looked comfortable, unfortunately.
I mean, I heard from one of the guys that was working down there. This was maybe 25 years ago. I was on the phone with this guy, and he saw something in the Observer. This is a wrestler that used to work in World Class. Yeah, Mike didn't want to be a wrestler. And the guy couldn't believe that he read that. He said that Mike wanted it very badly. And maybe not even, I want to be NWA champion, or I want to be, be an excellent pro wrestler and have 4-star matches. But he wanted the lifestyle. He wanted to be a Von Erich. I mean, what kid growing up in Texas wouldn't want to be a Von Erich? And now it's being handed to Mike. He sees his brothers, being treated like royalty. Of course he's going to want it. And I mean, I'm just passing along what I heard from someone maybe back in like 92 or 93. But, he saw that in the Observer and he just went crazy that, Mike absolutely wanted to be a pro wrestler because he wanted the lifestyle.
I mean, what really I would say the comparison should be, as far as probably who he should have been, is Ross Hart. Ross Hart, like Mike Von Erich, creative guy. Loved being a wrestler, loved being on the road with the boys, but did not have it the way that even the less talented of his brothers did. And I wonder if you groom Mike to be kind of working behind the scenes as a creative type and a sometimes wrestler, if that would have maybe been a much better spot for him.
It would have been a much better spot for him. The thing is, I mean, if you're I'm projecting a little bit here, but if you're Mike Von Erich, you don't want to be Ross Hart. You want to be Kerry Von Erich. You want to have all the girls screaming for you. Another thing I think I've pointed out on this show about Mike Von Erich before, if I ever already done this, I apologize. Mike, almost died from toxic shock syndrome right around September 1985. I mean, he was in really bad shape and he almost didn't make it. Right before that happened, Mike Von Erich was huge. He was getting big for real. And I can only imagine why he was getting so big. But if you go back, and it's on WWE Network, if you look at a Mike Von Erich match from summer of 1985, you're going to say, wow, he's not that scrawny kid that he was when he first started in 83. He's obviously been training and doing whatever else it is that he needs to do to get big. And he got big, and maybe that had something to do with him getting so sick.
Maybe. I thought the story was that he actually that a medical instrument of some kind got left in during his shoulder surgery.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
I thought the story was that a medical instrument of some kind from the shoulder surgery got left inside him.
I have never heard that story before.
Or is that for Von Erich kayfabe then, maybe?
Perhaps. I mean, I know the shoulder surgery had something to do with it, and probably the fact that his shoulder kept getting hurt may have had something to do with, what he was doing to himself. But anyway, we are just about out of time. Bix, before we go, is there anything that you would like to plug? I would like to thank you for this appearance.
Real quick before we get to the plugs, maybe to end on a better note.
Oh, sure.
I have something that actually ties into World Class that I figured I'd bring up. So I haven't done this as much lately because they've gotten a lot more bogged down. But I would send semi-regularly Freedom of Information Act requests to U.S. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to get the alien files of wrestlers who had passed away, because that's when you don't have the privacy concerns anymore. And one of the ones I did it for was Chris Adams, and it has his 1099s from what he was paid in 1984. So I'm going to quiz you to see if you can guess what he made. It's basically two figures. What do you think he made in World Class, and what do you think he made about total in wrestling, including his shots with Watts and the like?
Okay, this is the year of 1984.
Yes, so he's a babyface most of the year, if that influences things at all with pictures and stuff.
Okay, he's middle of the card until he turns, and he did do a few spots with Watts, but other than that, I think he was in World Class full time. I am going to guess $120,000.
Total or in Dallas?
Total gross revenue for the year 1984.
Nope. 90 grand.
All right.
Now, granted, that's almost $225,000 today, which is a heck of a living in a easy drive territory. But given his push, I kind of get where you're going with that.
Yeah, I mean, and 90 grand was a lot of money to be made in 94.
That's a lot of money now to a degree.
Yeah. And, and like you said, it was an easy drive territory. You didn't have to spend money on hotels. You didn't have to get on airplanes for the most part in world class. So, wow, that's a pretty cool find, Bix. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. So, yes, as far as plugs, you can follow me on Twitter at David Bix. You can keep track of everything I'm doing there as far as podcasts, articles I'm doing as far as freelance at Deadspin, Mel Magazine, and places like that. And also, you can check out, I have my own blog/newsletter on Substack. It's called Babyface v Heel, and you can just go to that at babyfacevheel.com. Babyface versus Heels and babyfacevsheel.com also works. And that's where I'm putting any of the research or reporting that I'm doing that doesn't really fit elsewhere and that I'm doing on my own. And a good bit of it's free, but I also have some stuff that's exclusive if you do the paid subscription option, including the first part I did was free, but the rest, for the most part, of the series I'm doing on the steroid trials, including going over stuff from the trial transcripts and all that, that'll be exclusive for paid subscribers, with the idea that basically doing that instead of doing a book or anything like that for now. So
all right,
you can check that out at Babyface v Heel or even just babyfaceversusheel.com.
All right. And I keep forgetting to plug my own Twitter. If you just put in John McAdam, there's the picture of the guy hitting the other guy with a chair. I don't stick to wrestling. You get some wrestling, but you'll get some baseball and humor and this time of year college football too. I want to thank David Bixenspan for filling in this week. And I also want to thank our producer, Lou Kippelman, who does a lot behind the scenes. And this has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. We'll see you next week.